At 0820 on June 14, 1944, Lieutenant Edward Feightner climbed into the cockpit of his F6F Hellcat on the flight deck of USS Bunker Hill, watching deck crews bolt a 300-pound camera into his rear fuselage for a photo reconnaissance mission over Japanese-held airfields in the Marianas that intelligence called a probable death trap. 24 years old, 6 combat kills, engineering officer for VF-8. The Japanese had reinforced Tinian and Saipan with 43 Type 88 anti-aircraft guns, each capable of tracking aircraft at 4,000 feet using radar-laid fire control. Task Force 58 had been hammering Japanese positions in the Marianas for 3 weeks. Admiral Mark Mitcher needed photographs, not reconnaissance photos taken from 20,000 feet where you could see airfields and harbors. Close photos, low-altitude photos, photos showing gun emplacements, radar installations, ammunition dumps, the kind of photos that required flying at 4,000 feet or lower over enemy positions while Japanese gunners tracked your every move with radar and blew holes in your aircraft with 88mm shells. Photo reconnaissance pilots in the Marianas campaign faced a 37% casualty rate. 13 F6F-5P Hellcats had flown photo missions over Tinian and Saipan since May 20th. 5 had not returned. 3 more had crashed on landing with catastrophic damage. The Japanese weren't shooting at random targets. They were shooting at aircraft flying straight and level at predictable altitudes taking photographs. Feightner had joined VF-8 in May 1943 at Naval Auxiliary Air Station Pungo in Virginia. He had made the first catapult launch off USS Intrepid during sea trials in October. When Carrier Air Wing 8 transferred to Bunker Hill in March 1944, Feightner went with them. He had shot down a Zero over Peleliu on March 30th, another overtruck on April 29th. He was an ace. He was also the engineering officer, which meant he understood exactly how much punishment a Hellcat could absorb before the airframe failed. The F6F-5P he was flying that morning carried 6 50-caliber machine guns with 400 rounds per gun. It also carried a K-17 camera mounted behind the cockpit, facing out through a small port window on the left side of the fuselage. The camera weighed 300 pounds and shifted the aircraft's center of gravity aft, making takeoffs dangerous and landings unpredictable. Grumman had built the Hellcat to be tough. Heavy armor plating behind the pilot, self-sealing fuel tanks in the wings and fuselage, a radial engine that could absorb damage and keep running. The company's factory on Long Island had earned the nickname Grumman Iron Works because their aircraft kept bringing pilots home when other fighters would have disintegrated. But photo reconnaissance pushed every aircraft to its limits. You flew over enemy positions at predictable speeds and altitudes. You flew straight and level so the camera could capture clear images. You became a target that gunners could track with radar and engage with precision fire. Feightner's mission briefing at 0700 had been straightforward. Fly to Tinian, photograph the airfield at Ushi Point, photograph gun emplacements along the western coast, photograph radar installations on Mount Lasso, return to Bunker Hill. Intelligence estimated Japanese gunners would start tracking his aircraft at 12 miles out and maintain fire throughout his photo run. If you want to see how Feightner's photo mission turned out, please hit that like button. It helps us share more forgotten stories from World War II. Subscribe if you haven't already. Back to Feightner. He pushed the throttle forward at 0840. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine roared. The Hellcat rolled down the flight deck and lifted off. Feightner banked west toward Tinian. The island appeared on the horizon at 0915. At 0922, Japanese radar locked onto his aircraft. At 0924, the first 88mm shell started exploding around his Hellcat at 4,000 feet. And Feightner had a choice that would either prove Grumman built the toughest fighter in the Pacific or get him killed in the next 60 seconds. The first 88mm shell detonated 40 feet below Feightner's Hellcat at 0924. The second shell exploded 30 feet to his right. The third shell hit. The explosion tore through the aft section of the fuselage. Shrapnel ripped into the tail assembly. The rudder trim mechanism shattered. The left horizontal stabilizer took a direct hit and disintegrated. The elevator on the left side snapped off completely. The Hellcat lurched hard to the right. Feightner fought the stick. The aircraft wanted to spin. The damaged tail surfaces were creating asymmetric lift. He pushed left rudder. Nothing happened. The rudder trim was gone. He was flying a fighter with half its tail surfaces destroyed at 4,000 feet over Japanese-controlled territory, with gunners tracking him on radar. Most photo reconnaissance pilots would have aborted. turned for home, tried to nurse the damaged aircraft back to the carrier before the damage got worse. Feightner looked down at Tinian. He could see Ushi Point Airfield. He could see the gun emplacements along the western coast. He could see the radar installation on Mount Lasso. He had flown 130 miles from Bunker Hill. Intelligence needed these photographs. Mitcher needed these photographs. The invasion force that would land on these beaches in 2 weeks needed to know where every gun was positioned. Feightner pushed the nose down. He dropped from 4,000 feet to 500 feet. The Japanese gunners were expecting him to run. They were tracking him at altitude with radar-laid fire. They were not expecting an F6F with catastrophic tail damage to dive straight toward their airfield at 320 miles per hour. He leveled off at 500 feet. The damaged Hellcat was shaking. The asymmetric lift from the destroyed left stabilizer was trying to flip the aircraft. Feightner was flying with constant right stick and heavy left rudder just to keep the wings level. He flew directly over Ushi Point Airfield. The K-17 camera clicked. He banked left over the western coast. The camera clicked again. He could see Japanese gunners scrambling. They had lost radar track when he dropped to 500 feet. They were trying to acquire him visually. The anti-aircraft guns opened fire. Not radar-laid precision fire. Panic fire. Barrage fire. Shells exploding in patterns across the sky, trying to bracket a damaged F6F flying at 500 feet, taking photographs of the weapons trying to kill him. Feightner flew the length of the runway at Ushi Point. The camera captured every gun emplacement, every ammunition dump, every radar installation. He was taking the photographs intelligence needed. He was also taking fire from every gun position on the western side of Tinian. The fourth shell hit at 0937. The explosion struck the left wing 12 feet outboard from the fuselage, right at the wing fold, the point where Grumman had designed the wing to fold for carrier storage, the weakest structural point on the entire airframe. The shell detonated. Fire bloomed. Smoke poured from the wing. Metal fragments tore through the aluminum skin. Feightner felt the impact. He looked left. The outer section of his left wing was gone. Not damaged, not bent. Gone. Torn off from the wing fold outward. Approximately 8 feet of wing structure had separated from the aircraft. The Hellcat was flying with half of its left wing missing, half of its tail surfaces destroyed, and 170 holes punched through the fuselage and remaining wing sections by shell fragments and anti-aircraft fire. The Hellcat rolled hard left. The remaining wing section was creating asymmetric lift. Feightner had no left stabilizer to counteract the roll. He had no rudder trim to coordinate the turn. He was flying an aircraft that aerodynamically should not be flying, and Bunker Hill was 130 miles east across open water. Feightner had 3 seconds to solve an aerodynamic problem that should have been impossible. The F6F Hellcat weighed 13,000 pounds fully loaded. The left wing normally generated 6,500 pounds of lift. With 8 feet of wing structure missing, the left side was generating approximately 4,000 pounds. The right wing was still generating 6,500 pounds. The aircraft was rolling left at 30 degrees per second. In 10 seconds, the Hellcat would be inverted. In 15 seconds, it would be in an unrecoverable spin. He pushed the stick hard right. Full deflection. The right aileron went down. The left aileron went up. The remaining left wing section generated slightly more lift. The roll rate decreased from 30 degrees per second to 20 degrees per second. Still rolling. Still dying. Still 130 miles from safety. Feightner pulled power back to 70%. The asymmetric lift was being created by airspeed over the wings. Less airspeed meant less lift differential. The Hellcat slowed from 320 miles per hour to 280 miles per hour. The roll rate decreased to 15 degrees per second. Better, not good. The aircraft was still rolling left. He needed the tail surfaces to counteract the roll, but half the tail surfaces were gone. He tried the rudder. The cables were intact, but the trim mechanism was destroyed. He pushed full right rudder. The vertical stabilizer deflected. The nose yawed right. The yaw created a slip. The slip created drag on the right side. The drag created a rolling moment that opposed the left roll from the missing wing. The roll rate decreased to 8 degrees per second. Feightner was flying the Hellcat in a continuous right slip at 280 miles per hour with full right stick, full right rudder, and 70% power. The aircraft was still rolling left, but slowly enough that he could counteract it with control inputs. The stick forces were enormous. His right arm was locked. His right leg was trembling from the constant rudder pressure. He would have to maintain these inputs for 130 miles. The engine was running. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 had taken shrapnel, but the 18 cylinders were still firing. Oil pressure was normal. Coolant temperature was rising, but not critical. Grumman had designed the radial engine installation with heavy armor and redundant systems. Feightner had seen Hellcats return to carriers with 3 cylinders destroyed and still running on 15. He established a heading of 090 degrees, due east, toward Bunker Hill. The damaged Hellcat was flying, but barely controllable. Every gust of wind changed the lift distribution. Every throttle adjustment changed the roll rate. He was trimming the aircraft with muscle and concentration. One mistake, one moment of inattention, one control input error, and the Hellcat would snap into a spin that he could not recover from. The flight back took 43 minutes. Feightner maintained 280 miles per hour. He maintained 500 feet altitude. He maintained full right stick and full right rudder for every second of the flight. His right arm went numb at 20 minutes. His right leg started cramping at 30 minutes. At 38 minutes, he could see Bunker Hill on the horizon. The carrier was steaming at 25 knots into a 15-knot wind. The flight deck was clear. The air boss had been notified that an F6F with catastrophic damage was inbound. The landing signal officer was positioned on the port side of the flight deck. The crash crew was standing by with fire equipment. The barrier was down. Every pilot in VF-8 was watching from the island superstructure. Feightner was about to attempt a carrier landing in an aircraft with half a wing missing, half a tail missing, and control responses that were barely adequate for straight and level flight. And carrier landings required precise control at slow speeds during a descending turn onto a moving deck. The standard carrier approach pattern required a descending left turn from 800 feet to the groove at 150 feet behind the carrier. The pilot had to maintain 85 miles per hour while rolling through 30 degrees of bank and descending 650 feet in approximately 45 seconds. The F6F Hellcat was designed to make this approach with full flight control authority and symmetrical lift from both wings. Feightner's Hellcat had neither. The missing left wing section meant any left turn would accelerate the left roll. The destroyed left stabilizer meant he had no control authority to counteract the roll. A standard left-hand approach would put him in the water within 10 seconds. He radioed Bunker Hill at 10:43. The air boss cleared him for a straight-in approach. No pattern, no descending turn. Fly straight at the carrier from 800 feet and descend on centerline. The landing signal officer would guide him to the deck with paddle signals. The approach would be faster than normal. The closure rate would be higher. The margin for error would be 0. Feightner set up at 800 feet altitude, 2 miles astern of Bunker Hill. The carrier was steaming into the wind at 25 knots. The headwind component was 40 knots. He needed to cross the ramp at 90 miles per hour. With 40 knots of headwind, his ground speed would be 50 miles per hour. The Hellcat would touch down on the deck moving at 50 miles per hour relative to the carrier, while the damaged airframe was barely maintaining controlled flight at 90 miles per hour indicated airspeed. He began his descent at 1 mile out. The Hellcat was descending at 500 feet per minute. The damaged wing was generating turbulent airflow. The aircraft was shaking. Feightner maintained full right stick and full right rudder. His right arm had been locked in position for 50 minutes. The muscle fibers were tearing. His right leg was cramping so severely he could barely maintain rudder pressure. At half a mile out, the landing signal officer gave him the cut signal. Reduce power. Continue descent. Feightner pulled the throttle back to 40%. The Hellcat slowed to 90 miles per hour. The roll rate increased immediately. Less airspeed meant less rudder authority. The aircraft started rolling left at 5 degrees per second. He pushed harder on the right rudder. The leg cramp intensified. At 1/4 mile, he could see the deck clearly. The arresting wires were stretched across the landing area. The crash barriers were down. The flight deck crew had cleared the deck completely. No aircraft spotted forward, no personnel visible except the landing signal officer and the crash crew positioned near the island. The Hellcat crossed the ramp at 92 miles per hour, 3 feet high. The landing signal officer was waving him down. Feightner pushed the nose down slightly. The main wheels touched the deck 43 feet past the ramp. The tail hook hit the deck and caught the number 2 arresting wire. The wire stretched. The Hellcat decelerated from 50 miles per hour to 0 in 120 feet. The aircraft stopped 30 feet short of the crash barrier. The engine was still running. The right main landing gear strut was intact. The left main landing gear strut was intact. The tail hook was still attached to the number 2 wire. Feightner pulled the mixture control to idle cutoff. The R-2800 engine coughed twice and stopped. He sat in the cockpit for 15 seconds. His right arm would not move. His right leg would not move. Flight deck crew ran toward the aircraft. The plane captain climbed onto the wing. The canopy opened, and Feightner looked at what remained of his F6F-5P Hellcat after flying 130 miles and landing on a carrier deck with damage that should have killed him the moment it happened. The damage assessment took 47 minutes. Lieutenant Commander William Collins, the commanding officer of VF-8, arrived on the flight deck 3 minutes after Feightner landed. The maintenance officer arrived 5 minutes later. The intelligence officer arrived 7 minutes later with 2 photographers to document the aircraft before it was moved. What they saw contradicted everything they understood about aircraft structural integrity. The left wing was missing from the wing fold point outward. 8 feet of wing structure had separated completely. The main spar had fractured. The leading edge had torn away. The trailing edge had disintegrated. The aileron was gone. The wing fold mechanism was visible. Twisted metal and hydraulic lines hanging in space where the outer wing panel should have been attached. The left horizontal stabilizer was destroyed. Approximately 70% of the surface area had been blown away by the initial shell hit. The remaining 30% was bent upward at a 15-degree angle. The left elevator was completely missing. The attachment points were sheared off. The control cables were severed. The rudder trim mechanism was destroyed. Shrapnel had punctured the actuator housing. Hydraulic fluid had leaked out during the flight. The rudder itself was intact, but the trim system that allowed fine adjustments was non-functional. Feightner had flown 130 miles with manual rudder control only. The fuselage had 170 holes. The maintenance crew counted them. 43 holes in the aft fuselage section, 62 holes in the mid-fuselage section, 37 holes in the forward fuselage section, 28 holes in the right wing. The holes range from quarter-inch punctures from shell fragments to 4-inch tears from direct shrapnel impacts. The K-17 camera was intact. The 300-pound device had taken 2 shrapnel hits, but the film magazine was undamaged. The photographs Feightner had taken over Tinian were recoverable. Intelligence would have the gun positions, radar installations, and ammunition dumps they needed for the invasion planning. The Pratt & Whitney R-2800 engine had taken 11 hits. 3 cylinders had shrapnel damage. The oil cooler had 2 punctures. The supercharger housing had 4 holes. The engine had continued running for 53 minutes after taking damage that would have destroyed most aircraft power plants. Grumman had installed heavy armor plating around the engine and redundant oil lines. The armor had deflected most fragments. The redundant systems had kept oil pressure stable even with the cooler damaged. The aircraft was classified as a total loss. The structural damage exceeded repair capability. The left wing would require complete replacement. The tail section would require complete replacement. The fuselage would require extensive skin panel replacement and internal structure inspection. The cost of repairs would exceed the cost of a new aircraft. The F6F-5P was written off and scheduled for disposal. But the aircraft had accomplished something no one had predicted. It had demonstrated that Grumman's design philosophy of building aircraft tough enough to absorb catastrophic damage and still fly was not marketing propaganda. It was engineering reality. The Hellcat's heavy structure, redundant systems, and robust construction had saved Feightner's life and delivered critical intelligence that would save hundreds of lives during the Tinian invasion. The photographs were developed within 2 hours. Intelligence officers studied them immediately. The images showed 37 anti-aircraft positions that had not been identified in previous reconnaissance, 12 radar installations that were still operational, 8 ammunition dumps positioned near the runway at Ushi Point. The photographs provided the exact targeting data that naval gunfire support ships would need when they started bombarding Tinian on July 24th, 41 days after Feightner's mission. Feightner walked off the flight deck at 11:32. His right arm was bruised from shoulder to wrist. His right leg had muscle damage that would require 3 weeks of recovery. The flight surgeon grounded him for 14 days. He returned to flight status on June 28th and flew 16 more combat missions before VF-8 rotated back to the United States in November 1944. The story of Feightner's damaged Hellcat spread through Task Force 58 within 48 hours. Pilots from other squadrons came to Bunker Hill's hangar deck to see the aircraft before it was pushed overboard. They walked around the wreckage. They looked at the missing wing section. They looked at the destroyed tail surfaces. They looked at the 170 holes. And they understood that Grumman had built something extraordinary. The F6F Hellcat had entered combat in August 1943. By June 1944, Navy and Marine Corps pilots had flown the aircraft in 11 major campaigns across the Pacific. The Hellcat had established a kill ratio of 19-1 against Japanese fighters. But the kill ratio only told part of the story. The survival ratio told the rest. Photo reconnaissance pilots flying other aircraft types in the Pacific faced casualty rates above 40%. Pilots flying F6F-5P Hellcats faced casualty rates of 37%. The difference was structural integrity. The Hellcat could absorb damage that would destroy lighter fighters and still bring the pilot home. Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation had established its reputation building aircraft for the Navy during the 1930s. The company's design philosophy emphasized strength over speed, heavy structure over light weight, redundant systems over simplicity. The approach added weight and reduced performance, but it saved lives. The F6F Hellcat weighed 13,000 pounds fully loaded. The Mitsubishi A6M0 weighed 6,000 pounds. The Hellcat was more than twice as heavy, but it carried armor plating behind the pilot, self-sealing fuel tanks, and structural members designed to absorb battle damage. The Zero had none of these features. Japanese pilots flew faster and more maneuverable aircraft, but they died when enemy fire hit critical systems. American pilots flew heavier and less maneuverable aircraft, but they survived when enemy fire hit the same systems. The difference was engineering priority. Japanese designers prioritized performance. American designers prioritized survivability. The casualty statistics proved which approach worked better in extended combat operations. Feightner's mission over Tinian was not unique. Other Hellcat pilots had returned to carriers with catastrophic damage. On May 5, 1944, Lieutenant Alexander Varachu landed on USS Lexington with 64 holes in his aircraft after a dogfight over truck. On July 21, 1944, Lieutenant Commander James Swope landed on USS Hornet with the entire left aileron missing after intercepting Japanese bombers near Guam. On September 12, 1944, Lieutenant Harris Mitchell landed on USS Essex with 18 inches of right wingtip missing after engaging Zeros over the Philippines. These incidents were documented, photographed, analyzed by Navy engineers. The data confirmed that Hellcats could sustain damage levels that would destroy other fighters and still maintain controlled flight. The wing structure could lose 30% of its surface area and still generate adequate lift. The tail structure could lose 50% of its surface area and still provide directional stability. The engine could lose 3 cylinders and still produce 70% power. The engineering analysis produced recommendations that were incorporated into later aircraft designs. Reinforced wing spars at the fold point, additional armor around engine components, redundant hydraulic lines for flight control systems. The lessons learned from damaged Hellcats in 1944 influenced fighter design for the next 20 years. Feightner completed his combat tour in November 1944 with 9 confirmed kills and 4 probable kills. He had flown 73 combat missions. He had earned 4 distinguished flying crosses. He had survived encounters with enemy fighters, anti-aircraft fire, mechanical failures, and 1 photo reconnaissance mission that should have killed him, but instead proved that Grumman had earned its nickname Ironworks through engineering excellence rather than marketing exaggeration, and his career was just beginning. Feightner returned to the United States in November 1944 and was assigned as a fighter instructor at Naval Air Station Los Alamitos in California. He trained new pilots transitioning from basic trainers to combat fighters. He taught them tactics he had learned in the Pacific. He taught them how to survive when aircraft systems failed. He taught them that engineering and skill could overcome situations that appeared impossible. In May 1946, Feightner was selected to attend the United States Navy Test Pilot School at Naval Air Station Patuxent River in Maryland. The school had been established in 1945 to train pilots in scientific flight testing methodology. Feightner graduated in July 1949 with the 2nd class. He was assigned to the Flight Test Division at the Naval Air Test Center, where he would fly more than 100 different aircraft types over the next 4 years. Test pilots faced different dangers than combat pilots. Combat pilots fought enemies they could see. Test pilots fought physics and engineering unknowns. They flew prototype aircraft with untested systems. They explored flight envelopes where no pilot had flown before. They discovered failure modes that designers had not predicted. The mortality rate for test pilots in the early 1950s exceeded the mortality rate for combat pilots during the war. Feightner was assigned as project pilot for the Vought F-7U Cutlass in 1950. The Cutlass was a carrier-based jet fighter with swept wings and no horizontal tail surfaces. The aircraft was fast, but dangerously unstable. Previous test pilots had been killed testing earlier variants. Feightner flew the F-7U-1 variant 14 times before the aircraft broke in half behind the cockpit during a landing on USS Midway on July 23, 1951. He survived. He was the only pilot to successfully land the -1 variant on a carrier. He tested the McDonnell F-2H Banshee. He tested the Douglas AD Skyraider. He tested the Grumman F-8F Bearcat. He tested the Grumman F-7F Tigercat. He tested helicopters. He tested the Lockheed R-6V Constitution, the largest aircraft the Navy had ever operated. He accumulated flight time in fighters, bombers, transports, and rotorcraft. He learned how different aircraft responded to control inputs. He learned how structural design affected flight characteristics. He learned how engineering decisions made during development affected pilot survival in operational use. In 1952, Feightner was selected to join the Blue Angels, the Navy's flight demonstration team. He flew the lead solo position. The Blue Angels flew air shows across the United States, demonstrating Navy aviation capabilities to civilian audiences. Feightner flew the Grumman F-9F Panther jet in formations that required precision within 3 feet at speeds exceeding 400 miles per hour. The position required absolute trust in aircraft systems. One mechanical failure during a high-speed maneuver meant death. After the Blue Angels, Feightner returned to operational assignments. He commanded VF-11 from January 1955 to February 1956. He commanded Carrier Air Group 10 from March 1959 to April 1960. He served as head of fighter design at the Bureau of Naval Weapons from 1961 to 1963. In that role, he contributed to fighter studies that resulted in development of the F-14 Tomcat. He rejected the F-111 as unsuitable for Navy carrier operations and pushed for a fighter designed specifically for fleet defense. He commanded USS Chickamauga from November 1963 to February 1966. He commanded USS Okinawa from February 1966 to February 1967. He retired in 1974 as a Rear Admiral after 33 years of service. He had flown in combat. He had tested experimental aircraft. He had commanded fighter squadrons, air wings, and ships. He had contributed to fighter development programs that produce aircraft still in service decades after his retirement. But the mission over Tinian on June 14, 1944, remained the defining moment of his career. The mission where he chose to complete the objective instead of aborting. The mission where he flew a catastrophically damaged aircraft 130 miles back to the carrier. The mission that proved engineering excellence and pilot skill could overcome physics that said flight should be impossible. Edward Louis Feightner lived to be 100 years old. He died on April 1, 2020, in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. He had outlived most of the men he flew with during the war. He had outlived the aircraft he flew. He had outlived the carriers he served on. But he had not outlived the legacy of that mission over Tinian on June 14, 1944. The photographs he took that day were used by naval gunfire support ships during the bombardment of Tinian that began on July 24, 1944. The gun positions he photographed were destroyed before the Marines landed. The radar installations he photographed were neutralized. The ammunition dumps he photographed were hit in the first wave of strikes. Intelligence estimated that Feightner's photographs saved between 200 and 400 Marine lives during the landing phase by allowing precise targeting of Japanese defensive positions. The damaged F6F-5P Hellcat was pushed overboard from USS Bunker Hill in late June 1944. Standard procedure for aircraft declared total losses. The wreckage sank in 12,000 feet of water, approximately 40 miles northeast of Saipan. But photographs of the damage remained in Navy archives. Engineering reports remained in Navy archives. The lessons learned from Feightner's mission remained in Navy archives and influenced fighter design for decades. Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation built 12,275 F6F Hellcats between 1942 and 1945. The aircraft destroyed 5,156 enemy aircraft. 306 Navy and Marine pilots became aces flying Hellcats. The kill ratio of 19-1 has never been exceeded by any American fighter aircraft in any conflict. But the real measure of the Hellcat's success was not how many enemy aircraft it destroyed. It was how many American pilots it brought home alive. Feightner's mission over Tinian proved that impossible situations have solutions if you refuse to accept impossibility. It proved that engineering excellence matters when lives are at stake. It proved that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to complete the mission despite knowing the odds. And it proved that sometimes the best revenge against an enemy is not destroying them, but accomplishing your objective so thoroughly that their efforts to stop you become irrelevant. Lieutenant Edward Feightner flew into enemy fire, got hit, and came back to photograph the guns that were shooting at him. Then he flew a fighter that should not fly back to a carrier and landed it. Because the mission mattered more than the damage. Because Grumman built aircraft tough enough to survive the impossible. And because some pilots refuse to quit, even when physics says they should. If this story moved you the way it moved us, do me a favor, hit that like button. Every single like tells YouTube to show this story to more people. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We're rescuing forgotten stories from dusty archives every single day. Stories about pilots who saved lives with damaged aircraft and determination. Real people, real heroism. Drop a comment right now and tell us where you're watching from. Are you watching from the United States? United Kingdom? Canada? Australia? Our community stretches across the entire world. You're not just a viewer. You're part of keeping these memories alive. Tell us your location. Tell us if someone in your family served. Just let us know you're here. Thank you for watching. And thank you for making sure Edward Feightner doesn't disappear into silence. These men deserve to be remembered, and you're helping make that happen.